The woman stood trembling on the train platform, one hand pressed against her swollen belly, the other clutching a letter that had been read so many times the creases threatened to tear through. Tears streamed down her face as she watched the cowboy approach, tall and silent against the Montana sky. When he stopped in front of her and spoke those 5 words, everything she had been holding inside shattered at once. But that moment came later. It began 3 weeks earlier, in a boarding house in Chicago where the walls were thin and hope even thinner. Eleanor Walsh sat at the narrow writing desk in her rented room, ink-stained fingers gripping the pen like it might save her life. Outside, March wind rattled the window. Inside, her stomach rolled with the nausea that came every morning now, reminding her of the impossible situation growing worse by the day. She was 28 years old, pregnant, and utterly alone. The father, if he could be called that, had been a banker's son with smooth words and empty promises. When she told him about the baby, his face had gone cold as winter stone. He'd pressed $50 into her hand and told her to handle it quietly. Then he'd married a congressman's daughter 2 weeks later. Eleanor had not handled it quietly. She had not handled it at all. She had simply frozen, unable to move forward or back, watching her savings dwindle and her belly grow. Now, for months alone, she was out of time and nearly out of money. The boarding house matron had begun asking pointed questions. The woman at the dress shop where Eleanor sewed had started whispering. Desperate, she had done something she'd sworn she never would. She had answered a mail-order bride advertisement. The letter had appeared in the back pages of a month-old newspaper someone left in the parlor. Widowed rancher in Wolf Creek, Montana, seeks honest woman for marriage. Must be of good character and willing to work. No beauty required, only sincerity. Write to Samuel Garrett, care of Wolf Creek Post Office. Eleanor had read it 5 times, her heart pounding harder with each pass. No beauty required. Honest woman. Sincerity. She had almost laughed. She was none of those things anymore. She was ruined, dishonest by omission, and desperate enough to deceive a stranger. Still, she wrote the letter. She told him she was 28, a seamstress, alone in the world after her parents' deaths. She told him she wanted a fresh start, that she was practical and hardworking and unafraid of frontier life. She did not tell him about the baby. His reply came faster than she expected. The handwriting was clean and deliberate, the words plain but kind. He would send money for her train fare. If they suited each other, they would marry. If not, he would pay her return passage. He signed it simply, Samuel Garrett. The money arrived a week later. Enough for a ticket and a little extra. Eleanor booked passage west with shaking hands, telling herself she would confess everything when she arrived. Surely, face to face, she could explain. Surely he would understand. Surely he would not send her back. The train journey took 4 days. Eleanor spent most of it staring out the window, watching cities give way to farmland, farmland to prairie, prairie to mountains. With each mile, her fear grew heavier. By the time the train pulled into Wolf Creek, Montana, she could barely breathe. The platform was small, just a wooden stretch beside the tracks with a single bench and a faded sign. A handful of people waited, ranch hands collecting supplies, a family greeting an elderly woman, and one man standing alone at the far end. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He held himself still, hands loose at his sides, watching the train with quiet intensity. Eleanor's stomach twisted. That had to be him. She gathered her carpetbag and stepped carefully down from the train. Her condition was obvious now. No amount of loose clothing could hide it. She had worn her darkest dress, her plainest shawl, but standing in the bright Montana sunlight, she felt exposed. The man started walking toward her. Eleanor's breath caught. She pressed one hand protectively over her belly, the other clutching the letter he'd sent. Tears blurred her vision. He stopped 3 feet away. Up close, she could see his face, weathered, maybe 35, with kind eyes the color of storm clouds and a jaw shadowed with stubble. He looked tired, but steady, strong. His gaze dropped to her belly. His expression didn't change. Eleanor's throat closed. She tried to speak, but nothing came out. Miss Walsh. His voice was low, rough-edged but calm. She nodded, tears spilling faster now. I'm sorry, she choked out. I should have told you. I know I should have told you. But I didn't know what else to do, and I thought maybe. Her voice broke completely. Samuel Garrett studied her for a long, terrible moment. Then he spoke 5 words that shattered every defense she'd built around her heart. "Nobody's sending you back." Eleanor collapsed into sobs, her whole body shaking with the force of them. Relief and shame and gratitude all tangled together until she couldn't tell them apart. Samuel stepped forward, not touching her, but standing close enough that his presence felt solid, grounding. "Easy now," he said quietly. "You're safe." Safe. The word felt foreign. Eleanor struggled to steady her breathing, wiping her face with trembling hands. "You don't understand," she managed. "I lied to you. I wasn't honest." You're here now," he interrupted gently. "That's what matters." He picked up her carpet bag without asking and gestured toward a wagon waiting near the platform. "Come on. It's a 2-hour ride to the ranch. We can talk there." Eleanor followed numbly, letting him help her onto the wagon seat. Her mind spun. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting or demanding explanations. He simply accepted. The wagon pulled away from Wolf Creek, rolling through open country that stretched vast and wild under an endless sky. Mountains rose in the distance, still capped with snow. The air smelled clean, sharp with pine and earth. Samuel didn't press her to talk. He drove in comfortable silence, occasionally pointing out landmarks. The creek that fed his land, the ridge where elk grazed in autumn, the neighbor's ranch 5 miles west. Finally, Eleanor found her voice. "Why aren't you angry?" He glanced at her. "Should I be? I deceived you. You left out part of your story," he corrected. "That's different than lying about who you are." She stared at him. "Most men would call it the same thing. Most men aren't me." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've known enough trouble in my life to recognize someone running from theirs. I figured you had reasons for coming west. Didn't figure I needed to know all of them before meeting you." Eleanor's chest tightened. "The baby, the father. Not my business unless you want it to be," Samuel said simply. The words hung in the air between them, gentle and undemanding. Eleanor swallowed hard. "He didn't want us. Either of us." Samuel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Then he's a fool." Something inside Eleanor cracked open. She had braced for judgment, for rejection, for cold practicality. Instead, she found something she'd almost forgotten existed. Kindness. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, a sturdy log house with a stone chimney, a barn, corrals, and open pasture where cattle grazed. Smoke curled from the chimney. Everything looked clean, well-tended, solid. "It's not fancy," Samuel said, almost apologetically. "But it's sound. Built most of it myself after my wife passed." Eleanor turned to him sharply. "Your wife died 3 years back. Fever took her fast." His voice carried old grief, worn smooth by time. "We never had children. She wanted them, but it didn't happen for us." He pulled the wagon to a stop near the house. "That's why I wrote the advertisement. Place feels too empty alone." Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. A large main room with a fireplace, a kitchen area, 2 doors leading to bedrooms. Everything was neat, almost too neat for a man living alone. "You keep it clean," Eleanor observed. Learned to, after she died. Couldn't stand the mess on top of the loneliness. He set her bag down carefully. "You'll take the bedroom on the right. I'll sleep out here by the fire until we're properly married, if that's still what you want." Eleanor blinked. "You still want to marry me? Even knowing?" Samuel met her eyes directly. "I asked for an honest woman willing to work. You came west alone and pregnant, which tells me you've got more courage than most. You could have lied to my face just now, but you didn't. That's honest enough for me." He moved to the kitchen and began making coffee. "As for the baby, well, I told you I wanted children. Didn't specify they had to come the traditional way." Eleanor sank into a chair, overwhelmed. "You can't mean that." "I don't say things I don't mean." She watched him move around the kitchen with quiet efficiency, measuring coffee, stoking the fire, setting out bread and butter. His movements were careful, deliberate, like everything about him. "Why?" she asked softly. "Why? Would you take on another man's child?" Samuel poured coffee and sat across from her. "My wife and I tried for years. Never happened. Then she died, and I figured I'd missed my chance." He looked at her steadily. "Maybe this is how it was meant to happen. Maybe that baby's supposed to be mine, just took a different road to get here." Tears slipped down Eleanor's cheeks again, but these felt different. Lighter. "I can work," she said. "I can sew, cook, manage a house. I'll earn my place here." You're not a hired hand, Eleanor. If we marry, you'll be my wife. Partner. Equal. The word equal echoed in her mind. That evening, Samuel showed her the ranch properly. The chickens, the cow, the vegetable garden plot waiting for spring planting. He introduced her to his horse, a patient mare named Clover, and explained his plans for expanding the herd. He spoke to her like her opinion mattered. That night, lying alone in the clean bedroom he'd given her, Eleanor placed both hands on her belly and whispered to the child growing inside. "We're going to be all right," she said. "I think we're finally going to be all right." They were married 4 days later in Wolf Creek's small church, with the preacher's wife and the general store owner as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple dress she'd altered to fit her changing shape. Samuel wore his cleanest shirt and looked at her like she was something precious. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her cheek gently, respectfully. Walking out of that church as Mrs. Garrett felt like stepping into a new life. The first weeks of marriage unfolded quietly. Samuel gave her space, never pushing, never demanding. He slept by the fire as promised. He worked the ranch during the day and came home for meals Eleanor prepared, praising even her simplest cooking. He asked her questions about her childhood, her parents, her work as a seamstress. He listened like her answers mattered. Slowly, Eleanor began to relax. She planted the garden, tended the chickens, sewed curtains for the windows. She learned the rhythm of ranch life. Early mornings, hard work, simple pleasures. And she watched Samuel. He was a man of few words, but deep feeling. She saw it in how he gentled a skittish calf, how he mended a fence with patient precision, how he carved a small wooden rattle one evening by the fire without explaining who it was for. One night, 2 months after the wedding, Eleanor sat sewing baby clothes while Samuel read by lamplight. The baby kicked hard, and she gasped softly. Samuel looked up immediately. "You all right?" She smiled. "Just active tonight." He set down his book. "Can I?" He gestured hesitantly toward her belly. Eleanor's heart squeezed. She held out her hand. Samuel moved to kneel beside her chair, placing his large palm carefully against her stomach. They waited together in silence. Then the baby kicked again, directly against his hand. Samuel's face transformed, wonder lighting his eyes like a child seeing his first snowfall. That's real strong. Takes after you already," Eleanor said softly. He looked up at her, and something passed between them, not just affection, but recognition. They were becoming something real. That night, Samuel moved into the bedroom with her, not for passion, but for presence. He held her carefully as they slept, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Eleanor woke feeling safer than she had in years. Summer deepened into autumn. Eleanor's belly grew round and full. Samuel built a cradle from smooth pine, sanding every edge until it felt like silk. The neighbors, once curious about the pregnant mail-order bride, warmed to Eleanor's quiet strength and Samuel's obvious devotion. In late September, on a cool evening with the first hint of winter in the air, Eleanor's labor began. Samuel rode hard for the midwife, Mrs. Chun, who lived 3 miles away. He stayed by Eleanor's side through the long night, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, speaking low words of encouragement. When their daughter was born just before dawn, Samuel wept openly. "She's perfect," he breathed, cradling the tiny girl with enormous gentleness. "Just perfect." Eleanor watched him through exhausted tears. "We should name her." "You choose," Samuel said. "Grace," Eleanor whispered. "Because that's what you gave me." Samuel kissed her forehead. "Grace Garrett." "It's perfect." The baby nursed, then slept. Samuel sat beside the bed, unable to stop looking at his new daughter. "Thank you," Eleanor said softly. He looked at her in surprise. "For what?" "For seeing past my mistakes. For giving us a home." Samuel shook his head. "You're not a mistake, Eleanor. Neither is she." He touched Grace's tiny fist. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." Winter came, blanketing the ranch in snow. Inside the warm house, Grace grew strong and healthy. Samuel proved a natural father, patient, gentle, devoted. He walked the floor with her at night, sang her rough lullabies, carried her everywhere in the crook of his arm. Eleanor watched him become the man he was always meant to be. One evening, as spring returned and the world turned green again, Eleanor and Samuel stood on the porch while Grace slept inside. The sunset painted the mountains gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked. Taking us in, Samuel pulled her close. Every day, I wake up grateful. You gave me purpose again. You gave me family. Eleanor leaned into his strength. I came here desperate and ashamed. You made me whole. We made each other whole, he corrected. Inside, Brace began to fuss. Samuel smiled and moved toward the door, but Eleanor caught his hand. Samuel? He turned. I love you, she said. The words felt new and true. His smile deepened, reaching his storm-gray eyes. I love you too. Both of you. Always. Together they went inside to tend their daughter, closing the door against the cooling evening. The ranch stood solid against the Montana sky, sheltering a family built not from perfection, but from grace, given freely, accepted gratefully, and returned in full measure every single day.